Violent youth crime. It's not something that we normally associate with the decade following the end of World War II and the slightly later Korean conflict. Usually, these are the types of images that we associate with the carefree years of the 1950s and early 1960s. Or, to be more precise, these. However, violent youth crime was a genuine concern during that time, and this concern over what used to be referred to as juvenile delinquency genuinely scared the daylights out of many parents, teachers, and other adult authority figures, often to the bewilderment of their children and students, most of whom were law-abiding, generally didn't have much interest in the current events of their youth, due to responsibilities with school, work, extracurricular activities, and honestly pursuing each other, as well as the then non-existence of social media. Were often unaware of what some of their same-age contemporaries were doing, both to each other and sometimes even to adults. And when we say juvenile delinquency, we are not referring to hubcap stealing or chewing gum in class. We don't mean this. More on how that primarily fictional image came to be at the end. For viewers who prefer their 1950s narrative to be along the lines of this, go to the top right and click for the options to hide and stop seeing videos like this. As 1950s fans and historians, we're about promoting reality while researching and reaching out to fellow like-minded 1950s fans. Since these have been the dominant image for decades for the 1950s, this video is for us. Now that that's out of the way, here are a few examples, a brief introduction, of real-life historic 1950s youth crime, the type of which caused a decade-long panic, nearly destroyed an American visual and print art form, and even caused a raw American style of music to shy away from its original roots into a more parent-acceptable sound. Seriously, the panic also gave us some classic movies and even a beloved musical stage play. And many of us thought the 1950s was solely about fins, sock hops, and hula hoops. America's participation in the Korean police action, was already 2 years in when local San Francisco Bay Area youth gangs had their own war of sorts that made national notoriety in March of 1952. That was when, just after midnight on March 30th, as the annual Butcher's Ball dance party was winding down, that 19-year-old Robert Arthur Ranson shot down gang rival Norman Botello near the fountain just outside of the Civic Center auditorium where the dance was held. Ranson, at the age of 12, had suffered from a bout of rheumatic fever, the result of which compromised his heart, affecting his stamina and dashing his childhood hopes of becoming an athlete. Forced to trade in basketball shorts for a water bucket and handful of towels as a water boy on the basketball team, Ranson, to the dismay of his loving and hardworking parents, found the status that he was longing for by falling in with a gang of well-dressed teenage gangsters out of the Portola district. Racking up an impressive police record between the years 1950 to 1952, including burglary, assault, and car theft, the 6'3" Ranson, described by one San Francisco reporter present at his later trial as well-dressed and handsome, also took to carrying a .45 caliber pistol in a shoulder holster. Well, we did say that despite his tall frame, he was physically compromised. Perhaps that is why, after agreeing to a group fistfight outside of the dance, with Ranson's Portolas against the much shorter Norman Botello and his gang from the Fillmore district, that Ranson drew a pistol instead. The girls from each of the different groups were also there, and Botello's girlfriend, 19-year-old Edith Apodaca, had even tried to disarm Ranson, grabbing our would-be basketball hero from behind before receiving the butt of Ranson's pistol for her trouble. That's when the Civic Center shooter shot and killed Botello, along with another 19-year-old, Andrew Ulibari, while wounding James Bennett, Thomas Hinman, and James Erickson. Sounds more like a scene out of many a 1950s TV and movie western than the stereotype of a 1950s gang rumble. Ranson would be handed a life sentence, serving out his time in San Quentin prison, though, as we know, a life sentence doesn't necessarily mean an actual lifetime of imprisonment. According to the California Archive, which houses surviving historical documents and records for the state, Ranson was up for parole in 1966 but wasn't discharged until 1977. The irony is that Ranson and Botello didn't even personally know each other and hadn't met until the night at the dance. Yes, it was just like a teenage romance, but in reverse, as they eyed each other across a crowded dance floor before deciding that he was the one. Ah, hate at first sight. Two more notable details should be pointed out. First, according to a surviving witness contacted through the San Francisco Remembered Facebook group, who was a teenager in 1952 and was at that Butcher's Ball dance, when shots were heard outside, many of the girls who were inside the auditorium actually ran towards the sound of gunfire. Really, girls? Second, surviving press reports frequently noted the well-dressed nature of those arrested in this entire affair, including Ranson himself. Ranson, his Portola gang, as well as their Fillmore, Mission, and Potrero Hill rivals and allies were, most likely, members of the White Shoe gang subculture. White shoe because of the white buckskin shoes, along with the clean-cut Ivy League mode of dress that participants in this very San Francisco 1950s subculture sported. Yes, that's Pat Boone, and no, he himself wasn't a gang member, as far as we know anyway. But these San Francisco white shoe gangs seem to favor the very same fashion sense that the singer of ballads like Love Letters in the Sand and notoriously laughable covers of Little Richard's and Fats Domino's rock and roll songs later popularized. Members of the white shoe subculture would make national headlines again in 1956, again just after a dance party, like this one on Halloween night of that year, as four members of a fashionably dressed group of boys decided to go on an after-dance party stabbing spree. Among their victims was 15-year-old John Alpa Jr., whose heart had been pierced by a switchblade knife. The innocent non-gang member actually survived, and yes, that's his understandably worried parents. The four boys were later arrested, and again, just like Ranson 4 years earlier, their impeccably dressed fashions at the time of their arrests were noted. Just like Ranson, they had long records with the surviving documents provided by the California Archives of two of them, Clement Anderson and Earl Hall, showing that as early as the age of 13, they had been arrested for possession of heroin. Whether or not they were well dressed as 13-year-old drug pushers is not noted, but the arrests of youthful offenders of San Francisco's white shoe subculture show that not all 1950s juvenile delinquents resembled the black leather jacket and blue jeans greaser stereotype. Speaking of the term greasers, when referring to 1950s gangs, that regional term, that was not used everywhere to describe 50s teen gangs, could actually be applied to our next example. The back of the yards was a working-class section of Chicago, and the youth gang that gained notoriety from that area during the second half of the 1950s was the Rebels, who claimed Cornell Square Park as their turf. The Rebels were, however, just one of many 1950s-era teenage street gangs out of Chicago that garnered national notoriety due to their less than peaceful activities. Some of the harmless and carefree 50s hijinks that these stone greasers, as Chicago's teenage social clubs called themselves, included the July 1955 drive-by shooting murder of 17-year-old Kenneth Sloboda, committed by 14-year-old Clement Cookie Massis. No, not that Cookie. The 1956 shooting murder of 17-year-old Warren White, committed by 18-year-old Fred Cruz during a gang rumble. Cruz was later acquitted on the grounds of self-defense, and in case you're wondering, this is White's grieving mother and sister. And on the subject of specifically the rebels themselves, and most infamously due to its randomness, the 1957 beating death of Farragut High School honor roll student Alvin Palmer, led by 18-year-old Joseph Schwartz and about a dozen other rebels. Schwartz was quoted as saying, "It's N-word time," and no, that's not exactly what he said, as we are speaking in code for social media. You can guess what he really said. And that he wanted to get a colored guy when he randomly picked Palmer for a beating while the honor roll student was waiting for a bus after he had finished his after-school job. Schwartz was sentenced to 50 years for the murder, with State Attorney Benjamin Adamowski stating, "If that's what they want to be, we will treat them like rebels." Curiously, the rebels actually began not as a fighting turf gang, but as an athletic youth sports organization focusing on activities such as baseball. The rebels' founder, Pat Salmon, who had long since left the club before they made headlines, returned to the now fighting turf gang to try to turn them away from their now violent ways. By the way, the original Broadway production of Grease, no, not the movie, takes place in Chicago, though unlike the greasers in that staple of many a high school musical production, the rebels were anything but cute, funny, or harmless. There was a notable attempt to turn the Alvin Palmer tragedy into triumph of sorts. After the Alvin Palmer murder incident, the teenage organizers of the 3rd annual Chicago Youth Rally at the Chicago Stadium, led by Mendel Catholic High School senior Tom Osborne, who, working closely with Judge Wendell Green, the first African American to serve at the circuit court level, dedicated their program to combating gang violence while promoting racial solidarity. They also had top rock and roll acts such as Gene Vincent, among others, perform, turning tragedy into hope with music and a message of love, a full decade before Woodstock. Still, an innocent kid did die. Speaking of innocent victims, that brings us to our next example. Juvenile delinquency is a term that refers to youth crime, and while many of the juvenile delinquents of mid-century America that captured headlines were inner-city gang members, some were not. Take, for instance, the case of then 14-year-old Billy Ray Prevatte of Pleasant Seat, Maryland. He was an early example of an active school shooter. Yes, we unfortunately have had to deal with that problem for a long time, even during the carefree 1950s. This young psychopath and all-around bad seed didn't like being told to write "I will not be disruptive in class" by his Maryland Park Junior High School teacher back on May 4th of 1956. So he left the campus, drove back, and no, at 14 he certainly did not have a license, while returning with a .22 caliber rifle. When his rampage was over, 3 teachers would be shot down, including 32-year-old Fraser Cameron. Prevatte bears little resemblance to the inner-city gang members from the same time period that would inspire Hollywood's mid-century socially conscious films like Rebel Without a Cause, though Reading up on some of his behaviors and background prior to the May 4th, 1956 shootings, Prevatte shared some similarities with Salmoneo's Plato character. As for the real-life post-war era youthful criminals, Prevatte had more in common with youthful serial murderers, such as the so-called Brooklyn Thrill Killers, not truly a gang, but rather 4 deranged upper-middle-class high school students who murdered New York's homeless in the summer of 1954. Charles Starkweather, the notorious high school dropout and James Dean wannabe from Lincoln, Nebraska, who went on a murder spree of innocent Midwest residents from November of 1957 through early 1958, including 2 beloved Bennett High School seniors, remembered by classmates for their selfless generosity. Madeleine Allred, an 18-year-old babysitter who drowned a 3-year-old placed in her care, Patricia Tiernan, at a Detroit hotel bathtub in March of 1957, or Nashville, Tennessee's Howard Ray Criswell, who, at the age of 18, shot at innocent passers-bys and tourists at the Woodbine and Murfreesboro roads for a period of 3 weeks in the summer of 1960 before he was captured. Criswell in particular noted his urge to kill. Then again, so did Madeleine Allred. Just like Prevatte, Criswell would be sent to an institution for the criminally insane, but Prevatte beat out Criswell and his contemporaneous teenage colleagues in notoriety as, due to whatever bureaucratic errors at Jessup, Maryland's Petusan Institution, Prevatte, as a career criminal, would be officially released, rearrested, then officially released again before being committed again. Yeah, as you can see here, Prevatte was a real cute kid on his way to an ignoble adulthood.